I hope that you have had a chance to at least look outside today. So we're going to talk today about equity in student assessment. One of the things that this is a topic that has been on my mind, and I've also had the privilege this year of serving on the faculty assembly task force that's looking at student assessment. And although it's looking at the equity side of it, is not part of the call, it's kind of working its way in there. We're going to make it part of the call. So this is also a little bit selfish that as we're talking, I am going to ask for your thoughts about what you think we could do better as an institution, so that it can kind of inform what might go in the recommendations in that report. So I'm going to share my screen. And I see, let's see, I know everybody. Okay, good. Okay, should equity impact our student learning assessment practices? So I'm going to start with two short stories. First one is, they're not really stories. The first one is not bragging, because I think this is probably true of a lot of people who have careers in higher ed. I am really good at standardized tests. You give me a standardized test and I will rock that test. Not that that has any applicability to my life now, but it has paid off for me in the past in many ways. It means that my SAT scores were higher than probably my actual intelligence. That when I took my licensing exam for my psychology license, I was able to flub through a few sections that I didn't really have much background in. I mean, it's paid off repeatedly. Why am I so good at standardized tests? Well, part of it is that my family is, I am privileged in that my family is highly educated. My parents both attended college, and they also were very academically oriented. So our conversation, even as a child, had kind of an academic flavor to it. My father was a college professor. So there was a lot of discussion in the home about what is education really like? What does it mean to deeply learn? And both of my parents approached the way that they interacted with the world in a way that valued deep learning and conversation with me in a way that was specific to our situation and our culture. They also consistently told me that I was smart and that I could achieve. So that when I was put into situations in which there was some kind of assessment of, are you smart and can you achieve? My preconceived identity was, well, yes, I can do this. So I would enter standardized assessment situations with a moderate level of anxiety, which is the perfect level of anxiety to take a standardized test. Just enough where you really, you want to do well, but not so much that it interferes with your ability to focus. And because of all that academic talk in the household, I also had like an extra twist on being able to understand standardized test questions. I'm better than some people at reading what the question wants, so I can more easily select the answer. None of that, by the way, has anything to do with my ability to do anything else. It is all a matter of the culture that I was raised in and how that has privileged me for certain academic situations. As a side note, there's all kinds of interesting research, by the way, on med students. What kind of med students make the best doctors? Not the ones that score highest on the tests, by the way. For example, underrepresented minorities who have been through med school often score lower on licensing type exams, but do better in practice. That what their background gives them a leg up in being able to have high quality residency performance, but does not give them a leg up on the tests. So what privileged me with standardized tests that's specific to that situation, but not to a broader context. Second story that I'm going to refer to as we're talking, I had a political science colleague in Texas that I worked with the whole time I was there, 17 years. And I'm going to call him Ed, which was not his name. And Ed was a good friend. I really liked Ed. I mean, he was a great support. We supported each other. And he was very student oriented. In Texas, there's a super high legislative political science requirement for students. All students have to take a full year of political science, including a whole semester of just Texas government, which is really kind of boring, and most of the students hate it, by the way. No international, just US, because in Texas, who cares what happens in the rest of the country? It's just Texas and the US. So all of the political scientists teach these survey classes. There's just way too much demand for them not to. And his consistent experience was that a high proportion of his students would fail throughout the semester or not achieve the level that he thought they were capable of. And we're talking 10 years, 15 years of him teaching these classes and trying everything he could come up with. And his students were consistently, actually a high proportion of them were literally failing the classes. He was a really smart guy. And it tore him up thinking about what in the world he could try next, because he had tried everything he could think of to help his students to better achieve. And he could not find the magic formula. So we're going to talk about Ed some more, but that's my story about Ed. And before we get too much further, I want to clarify I have two assumptions that as I'm talking today, these assumptions are going to be in place. And if you disagree with these assumptions, we might have to go backwards some so that we can talk about the assumptions. But I'm going to assume we all are having these assumptions. First, education should be a driver of equity and social justice. It should not perpetuate inequities. We shouldn't be doing things at the university that perpetuate inequities. If we know we're doing that, we should change. We should do things that make the world a more equitable place. So that's the first assumption. The second assumption is that student learning assessment is important and useful. Because if you think it's stupid and has no purpose, then you probably shouldn't have come today. But when we talk about, what am I talking about when I talk about student learning assessment? I'm specifically referring to student learning outcome or objective assessment or SLO assessment, but I am talking more broadly as well. Now, for those of you who don't do much in the student learning assessment vein, these are the statements that are associated with your major program that describe what students should be able to do or value as a result of completing the major. So here's an example from our economics program. They want all of the economics graduates to be able to analyze and evaluate behavior and outcomes using economic concepts and models, and they have a longer description to describe what that would look like. So that's what we're talking about when I'm talking about evaluating student learning. But of course, the way that the economics faculty assess this outcome is very closely tied to their pedagogy, how they assess student learning in class, how they think education should work. It's closely tied into all of that. So even though we're talking about student learning outcome assessment, it's really also student learning assessment broadly. And by the way, I'm going to be drawing much of this from the work of NALOA. NALOA has exceptional equity resources right now. They have, over the last 5 years, they have really developed fabulous resources in this area. This 2020 report is actually what we're going to be referencing quite a bit today, but they also have a report from 2017, which is this one in the background, and a number of responses from scholars around the country and some case studies that go with these. It's an exceptional set of resources, and I will share those direct links as well. So if we're going to talk about equity-minded assessment, what is that? Well, I don't have a cute definition. I wish I did, but I don't. There's no perfect shared definition. In the NALOA 2020 report, there's a nice description of how it probably includes culturally responsive assessment, socially just assessment, and critical assessment, and what each of those kind of schools of assessment thought are. But the short version is that at its core, equitable assessment calls for those who lead and participate in assessment activities to pay attention and be conscious of how assessment can either feed into cycles that perpetuate inequities or can serve to bring more equity into higher education. So equity-minded assessment is essentially keeping equity in mind as you do assessment. How might your own perspective influence the way that you're choosing to assess students? How might your limited perspective feed into either cycles that perpetuate inequity, or how can you broaden that perspective so that you can use assessment as a tool for equity? Okay, so what does that mean? What should we do? So we're going to spend our time today talking about 6 practices that 2020 Montenegro and Jankowski report recommends. So 6 practices, and we'll take pauses every so often because I'm sure you are going to have lots and lots of thoughts. So first practice, we should check our biases and ask reflective questions throughout the assessment process to address assumptions and positions of privilege. So when we have these thoughts underneath the surface, these thoughts that say things like, these students, whatever that means, I did it differently, or these students don't perform like the ones that we had 10 years ago, or I would have them do it this way, but they're doing it a different way. Those are all cues that we have assumptions that we are embedding into both our pedagogies and our assessment related to our own limited perspectives. Yes, our students do things differently than we did because they are different people than we are. And yes, our students now are different than the ones we had 10 years ago. They are literally different. For one thing, they are actually different people. Our students 10 years ago graduated and went off into the world. They have different life experiences. They have different cultural backgrounds. And even if they were demographically identical, they are still different. So that means even if you think that students 10 years ago were somehow superior in some way, for one thing, you probably are remembering them kind of in a rosy way, but they literally are different. So if you're approaching students now in the same way that we approached them 10 years ago, you're going to miss the mark because you're aiming at the wrong target. So let's talk some more about my colleague, Ed. And I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute. I would love to hear your perspectives. Ed did everything he could think of in his political science course. Everything he could think of. And his students' performance basically never changed. What would you have suggested for Ed? Oh, I should say, Ed was a white guy. He had worked at, middle-aged white guy. He had worked at another university in California where the students that he worked with did much better when he used those same techniques. That's his background. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mamta.
I mean, for me, any basis, if you want your students to do well, it has to begin with a good relationship. And probably Ed did not have that kind of a relationship or respect for various things about the students, and students did not have respect for his ideas and value systems. So I guess the relationship was skewed or a little disorganized.
So that's a great hypothesis, and maybe having a trusted colleague come and sit quietly in his class and observe the interactions might help to get at that. What else would you have suggested for Ed? Go ahead, Preeti.
So one, I mean, you just said that, the students are literally different. So, and kind of different generations. So kind of look at who the students are. And so before you get to an assessment, you have this interaction going on with students during, regular class where it's not a formal assessment, but you are asking them questions and, getting some answers. So like, I teach my calculus class, and today I was teaching, and I got an answer, and then I was like, okay, why aren't these guys getting the answer? And one student literally just asked me, how did you change that square root? And then I realized, oops, that's something different. So, some assumption that you are making, it does not gel with what, and it's a small thing. It's not something major, but it can change for how you assess and what you assess and how the students respond.
Yes, absolutely. And for those of you who don't know my background, I was in South Texas at a Hispanic serving institution. The student body was 89% Mexican American, primarily second generation immigrants. Their parents had come to the US or their grandparents. There weren't a lot of first generation immigrants, but it was right on the Texas-Mexico border. The students were highly bilingual. Over 50% of the students were bilingual in Spanish and English, and most of them had family ties on both sides of the border. So that was the student body. Go ahead, Donna.
Two thoughts. One, I was wondering what his relationship to the material was and what his enthusiasm level related to the subject matter was, and also what the students' relationship to the subject matter was, especially now that you've said what the student body was. I don't know what version of history they were learning or political science they were learning, but it might not have been one that they intuitively recognized as relevant to their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Yes. His level of enthusiasm was pretty high. Their level of enthusiasm was like in the tank. First, it was required. They'd already had like tons of Texas history all through K through 12. It is a highly legislatively regulated curriculum, but it's all predominantly white history. Mexican American history is not. I mean, you have to have a pretty motivated high school teacher should have interjected that. And yes, this is poli-sci and not history, but they're intertwined. And I think one of the things that reflecting on Ed, by the way, Ed was so well-intentioned. I mean, he was a good guy. He was a good guy. And he did his best for all of those years to not blame the students. But it was really hard because he had tried everything he could think of. And once you've tried everything you can think of, the next thing you think is, well, it's not my fault, then it's got to be their fault. He tried really hard not to do that, but it was hard to avoid because he had tried everything he could think of. And I think what the key phrase there is that he had tried everything he could think of. The middle-aged white guy had tried everything he could think of in teaching these Mexican American students. His perspective was limited by his worldview and his cultural background, his own history, in ways that he could literally not see. I'm not, and as I said, he's a good guy doing his very best. I still consider him a friend. I don't think that he was racist, not in any, he was doing his best, but your perspective limits you. So then the next question is, how do you broaden that perspective? So let's keep talking about, Janet, you want to add?
Yes, please. First of all, I would be interested in knowing what the students had to learn from the course. So for example, if you have to learn something from a course you will need to pass a state exam or teacher ed exam or something, then even if the course content is objectionable, then it's important that the students be able to parrot that back. And the same other thing I wanted to say was something a student taught me 10 or 20 years ago. We got involved in a real problem that happened in school where one of the secretaries had made some comment about why are all the prescriptions in 2 languages? They should be able to speak English, they live in this country. And students banded together and said she should be fired. So I was speaking one of my students, and I teach legal issues. Mm-hmm. And I asked about the laws and what law the secretary had broken. Obviously there was none. She was expressing herself freely, having been interviewed in a student paper. And what the student taught me in that, I was looking for moderation, I was looking for justice on both sides. But she said, you don't understand. She said, I understand what you're saying about the law, but you don't understand. I have feelings. Her feelings, maybe in the way that your friend Ed was also doing, her feelings made her come up with only one possible answer. And I took that into account with what I was teaching. So we tend to set up lessons with, well, here's the hypothesis, here's the fact, here's how to use it, here's what will make our students successful. But that's not the way everyone learns. Thanks.
Thank you. So we can continue to think about Ed. I think Ed is a great example because he in many ways, he sums up for me some of the struggles that faculty have. They try everything they can think of and it still doesn't work. And then you blame the student, not realizing everything you have thought of does not encompass the whole universe of possibilities. So let's see. Here's a great quote. Equitable assessment should work to ensure that learning outcomes and how we assess those outcomes are done in ways which do not privilege certain students over others, that data-informed changes are not benefiting one student group over others, and that assessment efforts are not conducted with only one dominant perspective or voice leading the process. So when we are naturally, very normally doing our human thing of saying, well, that's what worked for me, and that's what I had to do as a student, we are literally setting ourselves up as the comparison group and assuming that all students should be able to compare to that group. The second recommended practice, we should use multiple sources of evidence appropriate for the students being assessed and the assessment effort. And here's another great quote. The Three Musketeers fallacy, one thing for us to be aware of. The idea that in order to make a measure equally valid for everyone, everyone completes the same measure, all for one and one for all, as a means to ensure fairness instead of using different measures for different groups. And for those of us whose fields involve measurement and assessment of reliability and validity, having one measure is so compelling because we can assess the reliability and validity of that one measure. The problem is that one measure is often not equally valid for different groups of people, because we're looking for, when we're measuring learning, we're looking for something that will be a strong measure of what the student has actually learned. For some groups, it may be a good measure of what a student has actually learned, but for other groups, it may be a measure of access to previous educational resources. It may be a proxy measure of income. It may be something entirely different, alienation from the institution. Here's a non-educational example. The Marines' obsession with pull-ups is hurting the core. Now, the Marines have been obsessed with pull-ups for a long time. If you have kept like one neuron keeping attention to this, you know that the Marine standards for male and female pull-ups were the same, and then females have less upper body strength, so it's keeping women out. And then they changed them, and then when women were getting in with less pull-ups, they were being discriminated against in the Marines because the males were saying, well, they can't pull as much weight literally as I can. And now this one is saying, it's running out people who have strong capabilities that the Marines need, example, cyber warfare, because they can't do 5 pull-ups, or they ran a 26-minute 3 miles. Are running them off to Microsoft, and now we don't have them in the Marines. So another good example of a single measure, dependence on a single measure is not equally valid for all populations. So have you worked with alternative assessments that have worked well for you in helping students demonstrate what they have learned? That's my question. And alternative assessments often include things like portfolios, interviews, focus groups, when you give students an option between an exam or a presentation or an applied experience. what kinds of things besides the straight up most predictable paper or an exam have worked well for you as assessments?
I have done some gamified approaches. So we play games in some of my classes, like one of my classes is siblings and close relatives, and it's a flipped course. So every Wednesday, we call it Wednesday Fun Day. And the reason why we call it because it's going to be a day where you play either a board game or some kind of a Jeopardy, some kind of a Wheel of Fortune or Kahoot. Some gamified approach is applied to all the key concepts that they have learned on Monday. And students just love it simply because it's fun, it's engaging, but they're also getting clarified on lots of key concepts. So students have always liked that idea.
When I was teaching research methods in South Texas, my students typically did really poorly on the research paper. And that's almost universally in psych research methods classes, a research paper is almost universally required across the country. And they just were awful. They were horrible. But you have them do a poster in which they sum up the critical ideas, present it to their peers. They rocked that across the board. And I strongly believe that that was heavily culturally influenced, that the social component and the kind of interconnections with their peers were much more important to them and much more motivating. So they worked harder, and some of them, their writing backgrounds and their K through 12 experiences had not been really great. So the paper hit all of their anxieties as well about being poor writers, that the poster, since I had less text, allowed them to express themselves more freely. Go ahead, Janet.
One, I'd like to ask Mamta where she learned how to do those, make those games. I'd really like to know. And two, I always ask students to deliver assignments in exactly the way they have to deliver them after their graduation and they get a job. And although that's not always the easiest way for them to deliver the answer, they get it.
Yes, yes, that's a great idea. Preeti, go ahead.
Oops, am I okay? So in my history of math class, I have students write a paper as one of the assignments that they do, and it goes through the whole semester. So this is some idea that I picked up from one of the workshops I've been in, and I asked them to think of some mathematician that they can identify with in some way, and how they identify with the mathematician is up to them. And so it could be people have done different things like gender, of course, but and race, but also somebody chose Alan Turing because they identify with the way that Turing was kind of persecuted for his sexuality. So there are things like that, and they have to study the life of the mathematician, but also present at least a little bit of the math, whatever they can understand of it. And so I believe the students were quite, I think the students were quite enthusiastic about the project, and several of them wrote on the papers that it was a really nice chance to explore the life of some mathematicians from a point of view that they felt interested in.
Excellent, thank you, Preeti. Michael, can you unmute and tell us about your journals? I mean, when I say can you, I literally mean like, are you in a?
Yeah, I have crying 3-month-old in the background, but it's a pleasant noise for some too, right?
It doesn't come through.
So I've become dependent on journals for a number of reasons. The first is because all of my courses deal with potentially triggering content to students who don't want to speak out, whether that's a group of 100 or whether that's a group of 20. They don't feel comfortable sharing their thoughts on the content in that wide of a format. So that offers students a place to reflect on in-class discussions that they chose not to participate in, or ideas or themes from the course that they chose not to speak about in front of other people. But then it's morphed into assessment on their part. Like, they're telling me what they need, what works well, what doesn't work well. And so I read those at both the midterm as well as at the end of the semester. And so that's what I was thinking of as well when I was thinking of Ed. Like, did he ever ask students, because it's become this form of informal assessment, like, was that ever part of the, was that ever part of the assignments, and was that something that Ed was interested in hearing from his students? Because I got to tell you, it works, or at least it works for me.
And for those of you who don't know, Michael teaches classes. So you've got 90 students sometimes, and you still do journals, right? Yeah. I'm gonna put a link into the chat. And yeah, thank you for your comments. I didn't see John's comments on podcast and poster presentations. I'm gonna put a link in the chat. There is a great developing resource on innovative assessment resources. It is I call it a baby right now. It's growing and developing and aging. So right now there's just a few things, but it looks like it's going to be a really great resource. Okay, I'm gonna reshare. Thank you, those were excellent. Oh, did I go back? I went back. Ah, there we go. This is the innovative assessment site, by the way, which includes resources like real world assessment, multiple pathways for assessing student learning, social justice assessment, etc. So let's look at an example here. This example is from Portland State University, and it's also on the NALOA website, and it's from 2020. And Portland State University has a year-long freshman seminar, and they ask their students to assemble, as part of that seminar, an e-portfolio, which includes a reflection on the year and a set of assignments related to the learning objectives. They can include any assignments from the course, and many of the instructors also encourage them to include evidence that is not from the course, that might be external to the class, like a service learning experience or a leadership development experience. That could be a work-related experience, as long as it's related to the learning outcomes of the course. And by the way, they also evaluate these with the student's advisor, which I think is a really nice way to bring in other support staff from the institution to help students achieve their learning goals. But that's a side note. One thing I like about this is that it empowers the students to be able to select what they consider to be evidence that they have learned. It doesn't impose on them our preconceived ideas of this is the only way you can demonstrate your learning. They can select how they have demonstrated their learning, recognizing that sometimes in this way, they're not so good, that it really doesn't kind of sum up the wonderful things that they have learned. This other thing really does. As a side note, one of the things that we struggle with in class, right, is that a lot of our students graduate with super skills and no ability to articulate what those skills are. So they graduate thinking they can't do stuff when they really can do stuff. And it's hard to get a job, be able to sell your skills if you can't articulate what you can do, even though you can demonstrate it. What would it be like if our students knew what the learning outcomes were that they were achieving and knew what they were doing that showed that they could do it? So this is an example, this first year seminar, of students knowing what they're supposed to be learning and how the work that they're doing relates to it, so it can help them to articulate that. The third recommended practice, which ties right in here, is including student perspectives and taking action on those perspectives, not just asking them what they think, actually acting on their perspectives. One of my really wonderful colleagues in Texas that mentored me for years informally, he was so lovely. He did not get this, by the way. He was the most lovely guy, but he did not get this. About, after I'd been there about 5 years, we were stepping up our student assessment game, and the vice provost at the time wanted all of us to put our student learning outcomes for our majors on all of our syllabi. And he thought that was so stupid that he put them on because because she wanted us to do that for accreditation reasons. He didn't want to threaten our accreditation, so he put them on, but he put them on in like 4-point font. So if you really wanted to read them, you could read them, but not really. Actually, what he thought was the vice provost was had an education background. He's like, that's one of those stupid ideas from education, not realizing, of course, that our education colleagues actually have really great ideas and usually good reasons for what they do. And there we have the same problem. Students graduating my field of psychology with a major in psychology did not know what they had learned and could not articulate, even though we had really prepared them well for being able to do a variety of things. What would have happened if we had told them, invited their perspective? Student voices are important, both because they help us check our assumptions, but also because they are typically treated as the object of assessment in that kind of dehumanizing way, and bringing them into the cycle changes the way that we think about assessment. You know, if you go to a doctor's office, you don't want to be the object of the exam. You want to be a partner in your own medical treatment. And the way that medical practice has changed in the last 30 years, much more often people are treated as a partner in their treatment. We should be able to do the same thing with our students. So can our students make sense of the learning outcomes? Do our learning outcomes and the way that we assess them include multiple perspectives and life experiences? Do they speak to multiple assets and diverse life experiences? Have you had students in the room when you talk student learning outcomes? It changes. It changes. If you try and talk student learning outcomes with your students in the room, it changes the way you talk about Bloom's taxonomy, for example. When you say, oh, I don't think our students can analyze, I don't think our students can do this. If you say that in front of a student, it changes the way that you think about it and the way that you talk to them and the way that you interact with them. Just having them there, allowing them to actually participate, brings it up another level. Now, highly transparent assessment practice includes student voices in making sense of the results, including their own. Did they achieve the learning outcomes? That's another level we can strive for. Next practice is to increase transparency in the assessment results and the action taken. If you're interested in this, NALOA has a whole transparency of assessment model. It's very cool. It's like a whole nother level of assessment practice. And it's not that huge a step. In some ways, it's a big step mentally, but it's not that huge a step. If you're transparent in class with your assessments, this is why I'm asking you to do this. This is what you can learn from it. After they've done it, look at what here, look at what you can improve here. It's really not that big a step to say, well, this is a major-wide assessment. And if students are meaningfully involved in the assessment, then they need to be involved meaningfully with the results. And since we're focusing on students here, I have it in parentheses, but faculty do too. Obviously, faculty of all ranks need to also be involved in looking at the results and working with the results. It's part of the transparency. So here's another example for us to look at. This is an example also from the LOA. This is one of the responses to the earlier, kind of the ongoing conversation of it. So from Huston 2020. So this is a hypothetical. Let's consider this hypothetical example. A predominantly white institution wishes to evaluate whether students are, how they are scoring on the value, intercultural knowledge and competence rubric. Students are asked to respond to a story prompt involving an African-American first-generation female student who was considering leaving college during her first year. One of the rubric criteria for skills is empathy. Now, this is actually a well-accepted rubric, by the way. This isn't made up for the example. The highest level of the rubric entails differentiating multiple worldviews in ways that, quote, recognize the feelings of another cultural group. The former two levels are based on the respondent's preference for one's own worldview. When student responses are scored, it's an essay, by the way, an essay response. The institutional team that discovers that on average, the scores indicate that students are expressing high levels of empathy. However, when the results are disaggregated, the essays from the African-American first-generation students in the pool were more likely to be scored lower on the rubric. The team investigates this further and does focus groups with the survey responses African-American first-generation students indicated that they felt a strong personal identification with the character in the story. So how does that screw up their score? Because in the rubric, you get higher scores for identifying with someone from a different perspective. So they identified so closely with the student that their scores were reflective of that identification. What's wrong with this measure? That when it's used in this way, in this context, it reflects an implicit bias that nobody's going to identify personally with the first generation African-American student in the story. Instead, that can be universally used as an other culture example. Why did I stick this in here, by the way? Because it's right, and it's in between transparency. It's with transparency and involving students. If students had been involved in selecting this assessment, they would have pointed that out. If students had been involved in analyzing the results, they would have been able to point this out. Or if Houston actually uses it as an example of having diverse faculty as well involved in assessment, because diverse faculty would have also pointed that. A fifth practice is ensuring that collected data can be meaningfully disaggregated and interrogated. So that previous example is also an example of disaggregation, with the main question being, how do we know if the changes that we wanted to make are having the effect that we wanted to see if we can't disaggregate the data or pull it apart? And this happens frequently, by the way. So most of the assessments that we use, we analyze statistically, at least at some basic level. When you analyze things, even at the most basic level, like computing an average, you're giving numerical weight to the largest group of responses. Okay. So in addition to being able to disaggregate the data and say, what effect are we having on this group versus this group? Is it a different effect on one group than another? In addition to that, we also should have to think about a very common practice of eliminating small groups or outliers from consideration. So it's very common in across the country that if you do student learning assessment, you will eliminate small groups from consideration, because if they're very small, it can individually identify a student that you may not have said. We might be able to individually identify you. If they're very small, they have a small statistical weight, so it doesn't matter much if you include them. But if you analyze them separately, they're super tiny. But if you eliminate them from consideration, it may save you some statistical headaches, but it actually literally erases their voices. So let's say we eliminate any, if in our student learning assessment, let's imagine that we eliminate any group with less than 5 people in it. How often are Native American voices going to be represented then in our student learning assessment? Basically never. So that means that we have to figure out how we can continue to include them, even if it means we have to change our practices. So perhaps that means we exclude them from statistical analysis, but we look at the individual responses and consider them. Perhaps it means that we use this one assessment for the larger group, but we focus group for the super tiny ones because we want their voices to be elevated. But we don't erase them. Honestly, this was kind of a big insight for me. I'm so embarrassed to admit that, but it kind of was, because all of my statistical training says they're outliers or they're tiny groups or it threatens confidentiality. It's better to eliminate them. It is not better. It just means that we need to be more creative in figuring out how to incorporate those voices. As a note, I think this is a really important note. Data-related conversations should be interrogated, the conversations themselves, to ensure that data are not weaponized to facilitate self-fulfilling prophecies where results are used as proof that students are underprepared or disinterested, or someone can take assessment data and see say, see, I told you they can't learn. So this is the dark side of disaggregation. If you disaggregate student data, if our patterns follow the national patterns, which typically they do, we can tell you, for example, that Latino women are retained and graduate at a much higher rates than Latino men. We can also tell you that African Americans on the whole tend to be retained and graduate at much lower rates than white students, and that African American women tend to outperform African American men. That's what the national data says, and almost every institution, except HBCUs, who really have something special, that's what the data says. If you look at it on the surface without making sure that people are prepared to have that conversation, you can be pretty sure that someone in the room is going to have in the back of their mind, well, see what I told you. X, Y, or Z students, we do what we can, which is not the answer. So we need to make sure that people are prepared to engage in real conversations about this. Now, this might mean that that we could all benefit from professional development to help us interrogate our own biases. We need to think about who's involved in the processes. We may need to have facilitated conversations on structural barriers so people are more aware of different barriers that different groups of students may come up against, particularly local within our institution, the barriers that we have erected in front of them. We may have to have conversations about an asset-based perspective for students versus a deficit-based perspective, where instead of saying, how come they can't all behave like this perfect imaginary student, we say, look at all the assets that these students are bringing with them that were not what we were expecting, that we should be able to appreciate better. All kinds of potential preparation for these conversations so that people don't go to the easy answer and the wrong answer of, oh, well, how come they all can't be like our imaginary perfect student? I'm going to stop sharing for a minute because I think folks have stuff to say. Okay, let's start with Janet. Go ahead.
All right. Right. You can hear me? I forget if I muted or not. Okay, thanks. Can you please suggest one or two top ways of involving students in the evaluation process, which you suggested just a moment ago, or the assessment process, so that we can design an assessment process which frankly would be more accurate?
Absolutely. So the first thing that I would suggest, they're actually really short. I'm put the NILOA resource page there. They have case studies. They've got about 6 case studies that are really nice, and they vary really widely. Like Capella does like all kinds of previous learning stuff, and they're so different that they give you lots of ideas about how you might be able to do it. But literally just having students in the room when you do this work, so adding them to committees, having a student consultation group, it will change the conversation right there. And
Having them in what room?
so if you have, for example, if you have a department assessment committee, or if you have department-wide discussions when you talk about student learning outcomes and your assessment of them, having student representatives there. Okay, super tiny story. So CIT last week was really great. The keynote with Jesse Stommel was really great. And my 2 college-age daughters were in the room while I was listening to him, and they got really stressed by listening to him because he was talking about the struggles of teaching and the issues of cheating, the issues that are overblown, and they took it really to heart. So yeah, students can be stressed, so you need a little preparation. This is what we're talking about. This is where we need your contributions. This is what our Pretty, do you want to add?
I mean, it was more like a thought that, just with what you were sharing. So both for the last, when you showed the last slide, you said something about, we don't want to, when you have very small groups, you want to kind of, the usual thing is to leave them out. And I was just thinking, the purpose of whatever that assessment is comes into play, right? So if you are trying to sort of decide who are the students who are not doing very well, then of course you can't just leave out small groups of students. So yep, sure, you want to know exactly who are the students, with the purpose that you're trying to improve your own teaching and your assessment, and basically figure out where the problems are. But in a different situation, and I'm talking about, like, the value rubric that you took, or like when you're taking huge groups of students for something, and you're trying to say, well, this is a group that traditionally does perform well or doesn't perform well, then maybe you do want to leave out very small groups, because you are, ascribing what are like the group properties to everybody, and you don't want to do that, right? So you don't want to say that, maybe a particular group, I mean, Asians, for instance, Asian Americans are always this model minority and all that. And if you take their point of view as, the representative of the larger group, that's not right. That's not accurate for sure, but it's also not fair. On the other hand, there may be other assessments that you're doing where you do want to take into account why something is working for a certain group, whereas it's not working for a different group. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm talking about many generalities, but
No, I know what you mean. I think that's a good point. And I'm not going to go back to the slides, but out of the 6 recommendations, the 6th one is make evidence-based changes that address issues and equity that are context specific. Because you're right, the context of the assessment, the question that you're asking will determine what kind of analysis is written. But in very general terms, if we're saying this assessment shows whether our students are learning, and you've eliminated groups of students, it doesn't show whether our students are learning. It shows how we define what our students are, which is an entirely different question. So I see we're at time, and poor John will get stressed if we go on too long. I'm going to put 2 links in the chat. The first one, I would really love your feedback, because I'm really appreciate feedback. So the first one is a link to a feedback form. It'll just take you 2 minutes. Unless you've got really great ideas that you want to brainstorm about, then it might take you a little longer. And the second one is a PDF of the slides, so that if you would like them, you are welcome to have them. But I don't know how long John will let us stay.
Well, while we're separate from that topic, one thing I wanted to suggest is that while departments don't always get together that often to discuss their learning outcomes, all of our classes do have learning outcomes. And one strategy I've used in my capstone course and synchronous upper level classes has been to go in with the syllabus with the learning objectives and maybe a few details, and then deciding on the assessments with the students in discussion on the first day of class. And that's worked really well.
Mm-hmm. Other ideas? I think we've got time for 1 or 2 more ideas, or complaints, just complaints. Julia, go ahead.
Yeah, I have, I am definitely not very well versed in this whole subject, which is, it's a lot to take in. So I have a couple of concerns. One is, if we let students choose their assessments all the time, and everybody does that, let's say through their whole college career, then how will they learn to do the things that they don't like doing, like writing a paper, for example, right? So they still need to learn to do certain things, because when they get out in the field, it talks, Janet, I think, mentioned something like that, right? That she makes them do what they will need to do after graduation. So that's one concern with assessment. The other point is that for, let's say, my Bio 120, the Cell Molecular Foundations class, I have a lot of different types of tasks that the students have to do, right? That includes tests and homeworks, and the lab has a large component where they write papers, they do presentations. So there's a lot of components. And I would think that having different types of assessments should help, because different people are better at different things. But if you look overall, it's still the same students that are doing poorly across the board on all the assessments. And I think that has to do with their preparation for the course. So I feel like we first, well, maybe not first, maybe at the same time, need to address the fact that the students don't have the same educational background coming into a class, right? So they're not all as prepared to take in the material. So that's like a whole level before we start assessing them on the different things. Because at the end of the course, I still want them to learn that same material, right? But it's just some students are behind, and either they need to spend the extra time, which of course they don't, or, you know, it's like they need a pre-course of some sort. And it just concerns, and I don't know how to deal with this.
And I think that you're both good points. Thank you, Donna. Your second point I think is really important because you hear that everywhere, right? If the students had had better preparation wherever they were before they got to me, I think you have a good point, but like we literally hear that everywhere. And the sixth practice recommendation is focus on the context that you're in and your realm of responsibility and control. So I appreciate that what you're saying is how do we deal with those different backgrounds when we have them now, as opposed to saying, oh, they have such different backgrounds, I can't handle that, which is also something that sometimes you'll hear. Hopefully not with the hands like being thrown up, because that's a little too dramatic. Good points. John, are we at time?
We are.
Take us out.
Yes. So I think I'm just going to let it run and end the recording. I'll stop the recording for this session.